Today we are in our part 6 of my 6-part, audaciously maybe too audacious 6-part. Although, to be fair, and I know Beth has read this book, it's Danny Gordis's a Concise History of the State of Israel. So next time I bump into Danny Gordis, I'll say, Danny Gordis, I think I got it even down less than a book that takes a day to read. I've got a 6 hour, hour and a quarter lecture. So probably say that's not good enough. But anyway, there's Tel Aviv. Once again, this last part, I've called it From Startup Nation to Vaccination. We'll meet Waze, we'll meet a few other amazingly successful startups, and that's me getting my vaccine 4 months, 3.5 months into the vaccine program, which started this week. You'll see it in December, but I, as somebody who had Corona in the fall of 2020, had to wait until March. I just put the slide as I was talking to the rabbi at the beginning to make you jealous. Maybe this is yesterday morning at the Sea of Galilee. That is looking north to Mount Arbel. Beautiful. It's not as nice as, I mean, maybe it's not as warm then as Arizona is, but it is the Kinneret, it is the Sea of Galilee, and a lot more water than I've seen in many, many years. But that's not really part of the story. It's just a teaser to get you to push the rabbi and say, when are we going to Israel? When are we going to Israel? You remember last week, one of the last things I talked about, the last two things I talked about was the Arab Spring, end of 2010, beginning of 2011, and the social protest in Israel, as well as what happens, two of the operations in the Gaza Strip. We'll come back to, unfortunately, 2 more today. But I want to focus a little bit at the beginning on the, on the Syrian Civil War. And here's a map of Syria from 2011. And again, it's almost impossible to find an up-to-date map in Syria, but literally a day does not go by without some news headline. And you saw 2 weeks ago, there were, I think, 500 ISIS people, including 2 children. Front page story of the New York Times. Being killed where? In a place called Hasaka. Where did I circle it? I didn't circle it. Hasaka, which is just over here in this area that is controlled by the Kurds. Again, you don't need to know who is who, but you know different colors, different teams, unfortunately competing to death on this map. Here is Israel, just to put in context. There is the Golan Heights. If you can see where it says the EI on the Golan Heights, that's the Jordan River, right? And somewhere between the Sea of Galilee and the Jordan River is where our middle daughter lives. So very, very close to Syria. I mean, when things go on in Syria, she hears it. And actually this morning, I woke up and on my news flash on my phone, it said that in the middle of the night, a rocket landed from Syria, an anti-aircraft rocket, managed to get from Syria into a village around Jenin over here in the West Bank, by the way, not in Israel even, but that's another story. Some errant or intentional fire from Syria, claiming that Israel attacked something outside of Damascus. I think 5 soldiers, including a Syrian one, were killed at that time. So constant instability happening. But how did Israel deal with the civil war? It's their war. It's not our war. 5 major policies. 1, we're not going to be dragged in. We're not going to take any official position on any side. We're going to support the regime of President Assad. President Assad is of a minority religion called the Alawites. You might not have heard of the Alawites, but the yellow, to give you a sense of, that's where they live. Not a big population. And the Druze, who are supportive of Israel and Israel, supportive of Lebanon, supportive of Syria and Syria, because they're not a national entity, but rather a religious entity. And they are here and a little bit over here as well. And then there's a few pockets of Christians, and then the Shias, dark green. And then the light green, the majority of the country is actually Sunni Muslim, and they are the majority population, but they're in the opposition. And then up over here in the gray is the area bordering Turkey, bordering Iraq over here, called Kurdistan. Kurds are Muslims, they're an ethnicity, Kurdish, and they want to have their own country comprised of parts of Turkey, parts of Syria, and parts of Iraq. So Syria is a bit of a mess, but we're not going to get involved or take any sides. 2, over time, and you'll see in the next few minutes, Israel had programs to provide humanitarian and medical aid to the Syrians, regardless of what side of the conflict. People would be brought to the border, treated on the spot, or evacuated to Israeli hospitals. Thousands, I mean literally thousands of people were brought to Israel and then taken back to Syria without asking for any identity. Are you the good guys, bad guys? Because nobody knows who the good or bad guys are anyway. If there's ever any fire into Israel, intentional or errant, Israel will respond at the source. No refugees. You'll see how many refugees in a couple minutes will be accepted to Israel. Remember, we're still in official state of war with them. It's not Jordan, it's not Egypt, it's not the Emirates, it's not Bahrain. This list is getting longer, right? It's not Morocco, it's not Sudan. This morning in the news I heard that Sudan is sending a delegation to meet with the Israeli, with people in Israel to try to move forward the arrangement as part of the Abraham Accords with Israel. Good news. And 5, to make sure that there will be no Iranian presence or to prevent any change in the military status quo in terms of Hezbollah in Lebanon or having any Iranian presence in Syria. So here's the Middle East, there's Jordan, there is Iraq. Iran is just off the map over here. And as I mentioned, I think last week, Iran endeavoring to create the Shia crescent, which would go from Iran through Iraq, through parts of Syria, the Shia minority. Sorry, oh, wrong slide. I'm going to go back. Let me do that. Sorry, doesn't matter. The Shia minority I want to move you guys over there. Sorry, the Shiite minority in Syria together with Lebanon. But that isn't happening. And when Israel looks at the threat from Iran, it's twofold, really. It's multiple. But the two main components are Iran reaching the nuclear threshold, 1, and 2, making sure that Iran is not in a better position to wage war by proxy through Hezbollah or other terror agents that they supply militarily and economically. So what about the Syrian refugee crisis? Look, Syria was a country before the war with 24 million people. And if you look at these circles, these are refugees. So within this country of 24 million people, half of them are refugees, half in Syria, that's this number, 6 million, and the other half have gone to other countries. Turkey, Germany, Angela Merkel took a few years ago 1 million of them. But look at this, Iraq. What does it say about the situation in Turkey if Iraq needs to take 250,000 refugees? Iraq is not exactly the most stable place. Or what about Lebanon? We talked briefly about them last week. A country of 7-8 million people has got 1 million refugees from Syria. Instability not just in Syria, but in much of the neighborhood. As I said, half in Syria, the other half across the Middle East, and some have gone to Europe. Look at the numbers. And these are estimates. We don't know definitive numbers. 500,000 people killed, 12 million refugees. Again, refugees beyond the borders of the country, displaced persons, internal refugees. They're not in the place that they should be in. Their house isn't there. Their village belongs to the other side or whatever. Horrible. 30% of the infrastructure destroyed. The vast majority of people live below the poverty line. And guess what? Have we heard the United Nations Council on Security Council or Human Rights Commission have anything condemning what's going on in Syria or the use of gas by the Syrian president? In fact, he's being rehabilitated as we speak and becoming more popular in the Middle East and more accepted. And it seems that Assad has won the war. But Israel in a very precarious situation for 10 years. And the Air Force, 2 years ago, the commander of the Air Force said that Israel has had hundreds, and then we're talking somewhere between 500 to 1,000, to put this in context, aerial strikes in Syria in the past decade. And we haven't gone to war, which is pretty crazy. And what is Israel striking? Munitions depot, factories that are trying to make precision guidance systems to supply to Hezbollah, you name it, it's been targeted inside of Syria. Not always so close to the border either. Where actually is the border? About 3 years ago, maybe pre-corona, I was with a colleague of mine, a guy who lives in a kibbutz on the Golan Heights, and he took a small group I was guiding, and we went, this is the border, this is from my camera, from my phone, this is the Israeli border, this is a village in Syria, you see the bus over there? When we were here, this bus was literally, as he was talking for 15 minutes, all of a sudden, bus pulls up, a few people get on the bus, and the bus leaves. And it's not the regular bus that goes, from Highland Park down through Glencoe and makes it all the way down into the, what do you call it, into the stock market or the, whatever it is, down the mercantile exchange. Thank you. It's not that. We're talking about us taking people to save their lives out of their home that's being under attack. And if you see, it's hard to see, but over there's some gray. This is not sophisticated UPI photography. It's yours truly simple iPhone 10 from 3 years ago. Crazy. There's the bus, as I said. And from another angle, looking a little bit more to the right, there you can see some villages in Syria. And you can't see in this picture, but many times in the 10 years that I've been there with groups, you hear bangs and people are like, what's that? I said, that's unfortunately Syrians shooting at them. I know that can't be. I said, yeah. And then you look at this and you see plumes of smoke. Yeah, big time. A constant. Lots and lots of fighting. It's been quiet for the past few years already in the border between Israel and Syria, but it hasn't always been that way. And I should say, before the Syrian Civil War, this was the quietest border, the Israeli-Syrian border. Not a single shot, I repeat, not a single shot was fired from Syria to Israel or vice versa from 1974 until the outbreak of the Arab Spring in 2011. That's pretty crazy when you think about it. Here is an Israeli position. On the Israeli side, there is the fence. There is a city on the eastern side in Syria. And here, from the same position, but a little bit closer, you can see there's part of the mosque and the downtown of the biggest city, the new town of Quneitra, built just beyond the borders of Israel in the 1970s. So that's how close it is. And from where I took these pictures, we're literally about a 3-minute drive away from Kibbutz Ein Zivan, Kibbutz Meron Golan. Israelis live very close to, and agricultural fields are adjacent to the border with Syria. So it's this bizarre situation, to say the least, because over there is possibly the globe's most unstable country. Maybe Yemen comes close, or some other place in Africa, but it's crazy. For 10, 11 years, hundreds of thousands of people have been killed, brother against brother, in this country. The world can do nothing about it. But, of course, how we treat the Palestinians and that we're an apartheid state is more important to be dealt with than what's going on in Syria. Another map, just look at the colors, who controls what. The pink is the government, and this is a map from 2021, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, not even a year ago. Various look online for maps of Syria and you'll see 1,000. And to me, it's not really important who controls what where, but to see that the government controls the white is basically open desert. Nobody is there. You get a little bit of Syrian rebels down over here. ISIS was quite weak, but now ISIS is stronger. And the place where you saw the 500 ISIS people who were killed in the prison is the town of Hasaka. In northeastern Syria. All of the yellow, by the way, is under heavy Kurdish control. And the Kurds, as I said, want to have their own country between Turkey, parts of Turkey, parts of Iraq, and of course, parts of Syria. And look at the other colors here. You see the U.S., this is then. There are fewer U.S. troops there now. The Russians are the purple. Turkey is here as well. It is a mess. The Iranians are there as well. It is a royal mess. And it's impossible to know who's really in charge, what's going to happen when it all ends. And a lot of people, even Israeli Druze, it's complicated, but the Druze who live in the Golan Heights, who aren't Israeli, they're permanent residents of Israel, but not citizens of Israel. And I remember I would go up there, and there are a couple of Druze people who sell apples and honey and some of their agricultural products for tourists who come to look into Syria. And I'd say, so what's going on? What do you hear from your family over there? What do you mean, what's going on? Wouldn't you, Israel, rather have Assad in charge? Better than the devil, I said this. He didn't. Better the devil you know than the person you don't know. Would you rather have ISIS in charge or Assad in charge? I don't think Israel would have either of them in charge. But Israel definitely doesn't want to have Iran in charge and is very anxious about what's going on in the Middle East. And when we watch, for example, what's happening in Europe with Ukraine and Russia, I almost said the Soviet Union wannabe, and Russia, realize that there are implications in what's happening with Israel and Syria. Because 2 weeks ago, there was a Russian-Syrian Air Force flyover very close to the Israeli-Syrian border, which of course put a lot of the Israeli military on edge. And there's daily, this is from October here, but you can see over here, Israel said to strike near Damascus in rare daytime raid, 2 Syrian soldiers hurt. If you haven't been following this, it appears multiple times a week in the Israeli press. Something is happening. Israel vis-a-vis Syria, largely all sorts of attacks to, as I said, make sure that there's no change in status quo. Hezbollah isn't empowered in Lebanon, and there's no permanent Iranian force on the Golan Heights. In the midst of all this instability around us, Israel, as I mentioned last week, went to elections in 2013. Fascinating. The two main protagonists, Benjamin Netanyahu on the right, Yair Lapid in the center. Remember, Lapid was a journalist after the social protest movement in 2011. He went in the elections, and he got 19 seats in his new party, Yesh Atid. This other guy I mentioned last week, I think Naftali Bennett, our current prime minister, in this revamped National Religious Party, got 12 seats. And Lapid, on the center left, and Bennett on the right, said to Netanyahu, we will sit in your government with our 31 seats, equivalent to Netanyahu's 31 seats, right? And then he took another party, Tzipi Livni's. We'll together be able to have a coalition, but make sure there are no ultra-Orthodox in the party, and we want to deal with that question of trying to narrow the economic gaps within Israeli society. So that was when Lapid went into government, went from 0 seats to 19 seats as finance minister. Didn't last too long. Netanyahu, I had been finance minister beforehand, I remind you. He said, a few years before, under Sharon, put forward the plan to save the Israeli economy, but we'll come back to Lapid in a few minutes' time. And then later on today as well. Here are pictures from the Israeli side. You can see the UN. You can see the flags of Syria over here and the Red Cross in the middle. This is one of those places where goods would be given the humanitarian aid. Through this project, lasted about 5, almost 6 years. Operation Good Neighbor, fuel, diapers, food, etc., and of course, repairing limbs and all sorts of other things, life-saving procedures in Israel. I think I was with some guys from Nachshon way back when, maybe 6 or 7 years ago. We went up on and we met a major in one of the positions there. And he said, well, what happens here? He said, I'll tell you what, I got a phone call this morning about 3:40 from my soldiers. And they said, look, we need your help. What happened was they brought a child on the Syrian side, very close to where and of course the civilians know where the Israeli positions are, and they brought them very close to the Israeli position, put the kid down in a stretcher and said, take the kid away, he needs medical care. And the major said, well, but he can't go alone. He said, there's nobody who can accompany him to go back to the village? And would say, no, unfortunately, no, the entire family was killed in the bombing. And they went and they found a neighbor who the kid at least knew, who when the kid would come out of the surgery would actually recognize the person. Absolutely crazy situation. Thousands and thousands of cases of this happening under the radar in Israel for a while until it finally came out. In the midst of all of this instability that is constant along our borders, and if I haven't said this yet, I will say it now, and that is that on the one hand, the era of the major wars of 48 and 67 and 73 and maybe even 82 have ended by and large because we have peace with 2 of our major former enemies, now new friends, Egypt and Jordan adjacent to us. The cost and the challenge of protecting ourselves from non-state actors or proxy agents such as Hezbollah or Hamas is very, very different. It's very expensive as well. And although we're not dealing with intercontinental ballistic missiles coming from Iran, we might soon. We're dealing with simple rockets coming from Gaza. It doesn't mean that we can necessarily sleep any better. We don't feel that there's an existential threat to our future on the one hand, but on the other, we know that there are constant threats. In the midst of all of this, Israel continues to take advantage of this incredible concentration of brain power, of human capital, of science, of this, what our former Prime Minister and President Shimon Peres said, this satisfaction. That's what the greatest gift of the Jewish people, he said, to humanity was. In this context grows all of these startups. Perhaps the most famous early one that you use, I would say, on an almost daily basis if you want to get to the Golden Gate Bridge, hypothetically, is Waze. Waze navigation. I'd get into a taxi in Madrid a couple years ago. The guy puts on Waze. I said, that's from Israel? He says, no. I said, yeah, it's from Israel. I don't think he spoke English, but I told him anyway. We're talking about $1.1 billion in 2003. And it really was the acquisition of this that ultimately led to many, many more startups being purchased. There are, I think, what's the number there? 50 unicorns, companies valued at over $1 billion, which for Israel is huge. And this was the biggest one, $1.1 billion back in 2003, but it grows exponentially you'll see in a few slides. In 2014, Israel had our 3rd major operation in Gaza, which to me at least was very different. It began with the kidnapping and ultimately murder of 3 young yeshiva kids who were studying in the West Bank, hitchhiked, kidnapped, murdered, and then this operation Brother's Keeper to try to find the boys, arresting Hamas leaders in the West Bank. And then Hamas, in retaliation to Israel cracking down on Hamas in the West Bank, shot rockets. It led to an escalation that ultimately led to the longest continuous military engagement Israel has ever had. Longer than War of Independence, right? May 14th to early June. Then there was a ceasefire. Yom Kippur War, the 6th to the 24th of October. Much, much, much longer. It was different for a number of reasons. One, our firstborn, who's now 29, was involved in Gaza, spent much of his time inside of armored personnel carrier literally outside and inside the Gaza Strip. It was different also because Israel discovered 40 tunnels, command tunnels that we knew of already from Hamas leadership, deep under civilian areas in Gaza, smuggling tunnels, mostly from Egypt, to smuggle everything from cars to weapons from Egypt and Sinai, I should say, into Gaza, and terror tunnels. 36 or 39 tunnels whose exclusive purpose was dug under the fence, under the barrier, in order to come up on the Israeli side and murder civilians or soldiers. As I said, longest war in Israel's history, over 7 weeks. And the center of the country, Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, Ben Gurion Airport, which I picked my son up today. It's a 15-minute drive. I'm 9 miles away from the airport. When rockets landed or are targeted in the airport, sirens go off in our town. And for the first time ever, foreign airlines canceled their flights to Israel, which, given that we only have one international airport, I mean, the smaller one near Eilat, was quite traumatic for Israel. Really, foreign countries are cutting off any possibility of coming into or going out of Israel. Even though the rocket landed half a mile from the airport, it was close enough for foreign countries to close it down. In the midst of all of this, our middle daughter, oh, there you can see here, there is a sign from the airport, where to go, the shelter. And if you're waiting in line at security check-in, don't forget your bag, but how do you go to a shelter inside Ben Gurion Airport, as it was a target? See these all over the country, but this is the one from Ben Gurion Airport. So life is going on in Israel. Rockets are sounding daily. In the areas around Gaza, they become ghost towns. People become internal refugees in Israel, going to friends and family, so they don't have rockets every few minutes, and with not enough time to go to shelters. We had probably half a dozen sirens in the town that I live in. In the midst of all this, our daughter, she's the pretty one, that's me over there, is conscripted into the army. It's July. They haven't changed the conscription date. Life is going on for the rest of Israel, right? And she went to the induction center in Tel Aviv. And as we're waiting there for her to board the bus and to go to her base, which was in the middle of nowhere in the Negev and wasn't a target, the siren, the PA said, "If you hear a siren, please go into the building." So guess what? She gets on the bus, and then the siren goes off. We hear the siren, and there's no room in the building anymore. So we stand under this concrete roof, and we can't see, we hear the boom, 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 the thud of the outcoming Iron Dome rockets, and then wait about a minute or so, and then we hear the interception, all of them intercepted. We applaud, say goodbye to our kids, get in the bus, and we go home. Crazy reality of life, even in the midst of all of this. And here's a picture of our eldest when he was, clearly, soldiers don't usually look like that unless they're in the midst of war, and 50 days, multiple weeks actually, before he could shower actually, inside the armored personnel carrier in and adjacent to Gaza. First Friday, our daughter comes home. I'm not knowing what's going on with her brother, of course, in Gaza, but she comes home after basic training. And then this is the craziest thing. We have 3 kids. The youngest one, I said, just got out of the Air Force. Here you can see the date. He got his call-up notice. His first meeting at the induction center was supposed to be the following year, but he got that notice in the midst of this operation in July, August of 2014. During that time, all tourism pretty much stopped. I had a number of solidarity groups, I think from the New York, from New York City actually, and from the Jewish community there. And we visited a town in Ashkelon that morning had been, which is a major city, about 120,000 people, major rocket, not a small rocket that is made in someone's backyard, totally destroying this house in Ashkelon, near Sderot. Another direct hit. We visited a family that whose house, thankfully, they were okay in both these cases, but the house was totally destroyed by these rockets. And again, they're not sophisticated rockets necessarily. This is close by, but they can wreak a lot of havoc and obviously can be very, very lethal. In the midst of this, we discovered that I think the figure was about 70 Israeli soldiers, 67 soldiers, I think, and about a dozen civilians were killed, including 3. These young men in there with the circles around them from my eldest son's unit. And we discovered, after this was in the news, they didn't say the name of the unit, they didn't give the names of the kids, of course, but discovered that my son was involved in this particular incident. As working as a medic with the unit's doctor, they had to go in and basically get the entire team that was in a building that had a sign that was a UN school or UN clinic, and they were kind of waiting for the engineering corps to come and to destroy the tunnels that were near there. under the house, but it turns out that the tunnels were booby-trapped and the entire house collapsed on them. These 3 guys were killed, many others were injured, and then they had to extricate them under fire. So quite a traumatic event, and there were a few of those, unfortunately, in that crazy period. The challenge, as I mentioned, of trying to fight a terror organization embedded in a civilian population, it's almost a no-win situation. And of course, the world criticizes Israel. It's not fair. It's asymmetric warfare. Well, the asymmetry isn't in the power of the weapons that we have, but the asymmetry is in the logic of the combatants, of terror organizations embedded in civilian populations, intentionally targeting civilian populations versus a proper military, men in uniform trying to restore, men and women actually trying to restore peace. That's where the asymmetry, if anybody asks me, but you can ask me at the end. After this, we have elections. 2015, as I said in previous weeks, when there's violence, terrorism, wars, Israel generally responds by moving the electorate moving to the right. And so the Bibi-Lapid marriage lasted not even 2 years. The Knesset dissolved over budgetary issues. Netanyahu knew better. He had been the finance minister. He was very critical of Lapid, who had no real financial experience outside of maybe managing his own bank account. I mean, really, he was a journalist by profession before he got an amateur boxer, before he got to the Knesset. Israel went to the ballot box in 2015. Netanyahu got a right-wing coalition together with the ultra-Orthodox this time. Netanyahu was no longer a partner with Lapid. And literally 2 hours before the deadline, 2 months after the election, Netanyahu managed to form a coalition. Perhaps the most important controversial legislation passed by this government in 2018 was the Jewish nation-state law, which defined Israel as the national home of the Jewish people, in which it fulfills its natural, cultural, religious, and historic right to self-determination. Now, Israel defined itself in the Declaration of Independence as a Jewish and democratic state. And this nation-state law, brought from the political right, upset not only the political center and political left, but clearly the Arab minority in Israel. One of the articles of the nation-state law says, quote, "The state's language is Hebrew. The Arabic language is a special status. Until this point, the state languages were Hebrew and Arabic. And here it says it's only Hebrew from now on. Regulating the use of Arabic in state institutions or by them will be set in law." So big internal issue within Israeli society in the 2008 parliament under the quite right of center government of Netanyahu. But it's in this year where there is a even bigger buyout in Israel's startup nation, and during this period of the government, something called Mobileye. I'm sure if any of you are driving a car that was purchased in the past 2 years, when you start to veer out of your lane or get too close to the car in front of you, you hear a beep, beep, beep. A lot of cars, we have a Toyota, it's got its own technology that copies this, but the original technology is something called Mobileye. You might see something like this, or a speaker or a sensor in the front part of your car in some way, shape, or form, right? Almost every new car has that today. It was a company bought by Intel in Jerusalem. It's still in Jerusalem, and they paid a little bit more than Google paid for Waze. They paid $15.3 billion. Now, to put that in context, $15.3 billion is not a small amount of money, but in the context of Israel, an economy of $350 billion, that is gargantuan. I mean, 15 billion is big anywhere, but an American economy of multiple trillions versus 350 million in Israel, that is huge. Put it in context, when we had 4.5 million tourists coming to Israel up in 2019, they were bringing like $3 to $4 billion in foreign currency into Israel. So that's like 4 years of the most tourism that Israel has ever had. Just contextualize what that is in terms of the Israeli economy. In this context, of course, there are elections in America. It's a presentation about Israel, not America, but I try to use red and blue fonts just to make sure that I'm covering both sides of the political spectrum here. But as you know, the elections in America, President Trump is elected. And in 2017, he makes the following declaration. "I've determined that it's time to officially recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel." Now, press pause for a minute, because I want to say Bush, but it could be wrong, could be Bush Sr. For 20 plus years, there has been an American resolution recognizing Jerusalem as the capital and moving the embassy to Israel. And every 6 months, every president, Republican and Democrat for a generation, has signed a presidential order postponing that, right? Trump didn't postpone it anymore. It was 70 years ago, the U.S. under President Truman recognized the state of Israel. Ever since then, Israel has made its capital in the city of Jerusalem, the capital of Jewish people established in ancient times. Today, Jerusalem is the seat of modern Israeli government, the Supreme Court, the Parliament, Knesset, location of residence. It's true. And every head of government, every head of state who comes to Israel does business in Jerusalem. But today, he continued, we finally acknowledge the obvious, that Jerusalem is Israel's capital. This is nothing more or less than a recognition of reality. It's also the right thing to do. It's something that has to be done. That is why, consistent with the Jerusalem Embassy Act, as I mentioned, I'm directing the State Department to begin preparation to move the American Embassy from Jerusalem, Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. That's December 2017. And in May, on the 14th of May, which in Israel is not celebrated as Israeli Independence Day, but in Palestinian society is the Nakba, the day of that tragedy. We can see in Tel Aviv, a building that was already there in Jerusalem, in West Jerusalem, not contested Jerusalem, right? The area that's been part of Israel since 1967, about half a mile from where my mother-in-law lives, the American ambassador opening the embassy in May of 2018. At the same time, by the way, in Gaza begins this massive march of millions to try to reclaim their homes where? In Israel. And there's a lot of violence in the fence. Over 60 Palestinians are actually killed in a day of protest at the exact same time the embassy is opening. The president doesn't come, but his Jew by choice daughter-in-law comes, and daughter, I should say, son-in-law comes, inaugurates it, and shortly thereafter, you might recognize some people. In this picture over here, the men of Nachshon come to Jerusalem and smile for a picture in front. Oh, there's a lunchman. We talked about, I forgot his name again. It'll come back to me. Wait a minute. Rick, were you part of Nachshon that year? No. Yes, just thumbs up. Yes. No. Any of you guys were in Nachshon in 2019? Okay, good. I'll come back to that. Anyway, so we, Israel, go to elections, right? It's 4 years. It's time for elections in April 2019. The prime minister, on the coattails of the romance with the American president, all of a sudden very excited. We have elections. That's me, daughter, my wife. She's finished the army by then, 2-year commitment, and we are taking our little electoral slip that you get in the mail about a month or two before the election, based on your electronic ID card. If you're over 18, you get this, and it says, go to the polling station, literally below our house. You take your cards in, you wait outside. You have to choose from one of these. These are all political parties. We had about 30 parties that ran in that election. You choose one, you go to the ballot box, you take your piece of paper out. Where is it? Sorry. You take your piece of paper out, you put it in the envelope, they count them up, whatever percentage of the popular vote the party gets, they get the seats in the Knesset. But guess what? In 2019, there was not enough of any party, you'll see this in a minute, to actually form a government. So that's April 2019. June of 2019, our youngest finishes a year and a half basic training in this crazy unit called the Search and Rescue Unit of the Air Force. He's not in these pictures. These are pictures of the graduation ceremony showing what they do. They go in these Vietnam era helicopters and they search and rescue for civilian soldiers, whatever, and then they bring them up. Those like me who have fear of heights, this is not recommended, but this is what he did for 4 years in the Air Force. So I threw that in because, hey, it happened in between elections. And by the way, he served 4 years in the Army and he voted 4 times. Talk about that. We're always in the military. Kind of crazy. We had second elections because there was no government that was formed. A few months later in September, fewer parties this time. My daughter didn't show up because she was living up north and she voted up north. That's me voting. And basically, you walk into the room with a little pen and paper. They take your ID card. They take your piece of paper. They say you are who you are. They give you a blank envelope over there. You go behind the booth. It's all cardboard and paper. You pick up a piece of paper. You put it in the ballot, and then they count them. Very, very old system. Very difficult to forge in contrast to all sorts of electronic or no hanging chads or dangling prepositions or whatever else. Anyway, so we've got an election. First one in April, Netanyahu, prime minister, still can't form a government. We have a second one in September, he can't form a government. And then in January of 2020, he is invited by President Trump to America for the president's declaration of this peace to prosperity, his vision to improve the lives of the Palestinian and Israeli people. Now, the Palestinians never showed up. The settlers in the West Bank, Jews in Judea and Samaria, were upset. Why? Because they were going to be creating a Palestinian state. All the dark was going to be a Palestinian state, which would be surrounding many of their communities in the West Bank. But okay, interesting. American government let's see what happens with it. The prime minister saw it as a triumph, and it's come out quite recently, actually. The president, your president, was very upset when the prime minister announced that he saw this as an opportunity for Israel to annex part of the West Bank. But going too deep on that one for now, that was January 2020. One might possibly think that if you are an incumbent prime minister, and you have the support of our greatest ally, who has just moved the embassy, finally, to Jerusalem, and who has just announced this new peace to prosperity, and is really in our back pocket, you could possibly argue, as I would, more favorable to us, maybe clearly I should say, than to the Palestinians. This is good. Well, we went to the ballots again in March. It was a bit of a colder day this time. Now, I can tell you, your next election is going to be in 2024 on the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November, right? Whenever that's election day, right? Forever. It doesn't work that way in Israel. There's Michelle voting again. It's just pre-Corona, right? Literally, Corona had just started later that week or so. There's me voting, same room, same thing, but it ain't over yet, because still after that election, there was no clear forming of a government until, right, the split between, now it's left and right, there are parties, and these are all different parties, of course. This is Netanyahu's party, Likud, 36 seats, and this is the party led by the guy Benny Gantz with 33 seats. There was no way that either bloc could form a government, because this guy in the middle, who's right of center, Yisrael Beitenu, said, over my dead body will I ever sit with Netanyahu. But yet he wasn't a natural ally of the left. And so the left couldn't get his 7 seats, the right couldn't. But to go to new elections, unless this guy, which he did, Benny Gantz, bit his lip, lost part of his party, and went from 33 seats, as you'll see here, to a total of 15 seats. Why? Because only some agreed to sit with Netanyahu. Many of 18 of his party, including those over here and those down over here, said, hey, we ran on a ticket. Anything but Netanyahu. We won't sit with Netanyahu. And Gantz said, listen, it's May of 2020. We've got something called Corona. We've had 3 elections. We've all failed. I'm doing this for the greater good of Israeli society. Lost a lot of support, by the way, but had a government that lasted, and he was supposed to, by the way, be, after halftime, be prime minister. The government lasted from May until about December. So not bad, given that we've had the most unprecedented health crisis ever in this country and in most of Western civilization, at least in the past 100 years. But anyway, in the midst of all of this, May to December, we've got a government, 3 elections, very precarious. There is this thing all of a sudden that emerges called the Abraham Accords between us, United States, United Arab Emirates, in August of 2020, expanded to include Bahrain. They have this big handshake on the White House lawn in September, right? Ratified by the parliament. It's fantastic. And then the prime minister meets the president of Sudan and Uganda, and we're talking about normalizing with them. And then later on, we go to Morocco. What does Netanyahu say in the midst of this? And remember, he's prime minister of a very shaky government. This is a new era, an era of true peace, a peace that is expanding with other Arab countries, 3 of them in recent weeks. Who's going to be next? Well, Morocco, as I mentioned, announced in the end of December 2020, maybe Oman, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait. In the midst of this, of course, Bhutan, all of a sudden, out of the blue, I don't know why, but they decided that they're going to recognize Israel as well. Some people might think that it was less about this signing between Prime Minister Netanyahu, President Trump, the I think foreign minister of Bahrain over here, the prime minister, if I want to say, of the Emirates over here. Some people say it was really about recognizing Israel's right to exist, thankfully, saying that that these countries have a lot to gain by having relations with Israel in terms of desertification challenges, health challenges in light of Corona, cyber technology, helping us against the big enemy across the Persian Gulf called Iran. Others might say it might have had something to do, or the quid pro quo might have been a $23 billion sale of F-35s to the Emirates. Hard to say. But if you woke up the next day in the Emirates, and you read this English paper published in London, you might have seen, over here, there it is, the London-based Arab Weekly. Look at the headline. Israel freezes Palestinian annexation for UAE ties. So the perception on the street in the Emirates was, it's not so much about, us loving Israel, but hey, we're still standing up and paying lip service for our brothers, the Palestinians. The truth of the matter is, I don't think, unfortunately not, that the Emiratis necessarily care about the Palestinians, but that's another piece. Anyway, now we've got peace with Egypt, Jordan, Emirates. There is little Bahrain over there. It's basically this island connected by a bridge to Saudi Arabia. And we are talking maybe about relations with Sudan, Egypt, way off on the map over there. And the Middle East looks like a very different place today. So the countries where we have official relations and the countries where we have kind of a little bit less overt and much more covert, including probably Saudi Arabia. Rumors had it that the Prime Minister Netanyahu flew down and met over in Saudi Arabia with the monarch of Saudi Arabia, or MBS. We're not 100% sure, but it is a different reality to say the least. Where are we? And then the Prime Minister announces, I said December, I apologize, January, almost a little over a year ago, we now have diplomatic and normalizations with Morocco, which is very important, by the way, because Morocco, far away in West Africa, is the country with the largest, outside of Jews from the former Soviet Union, Russian, Ukrainian speakers, they have more, the largest ethnic group of Jews in the country are descendants of Morocco. Very, very big community. And for years, Moroccan Israelis have been going to Morocco via Spain. They can do it on an Israeli passport, even without diplomatic relations. But the walls of the old city were lit up with the lights of the flags of Morocco and Israel. Now there are direct El Al flights, by the way, and other Israeli companies to the Emirates, to Bahrain, and of course to Morocco. Our good friend Eitan was the temporary ambassador he's a professional diplomat to the Emirates. Now, actually, he just took his position in Bahrain about 2 months ago, a month and a half ago, and his wife Cheryl just joined him last week, 2 weeks ago, I should say. Fascinating to meet when he was back and forth a few times to talk with him about what's going on there. He had been the ambassador to Turkey, so he's very involved in the Middle East. And as he always tells me that, diplomacy is about, and relation to countries is about interests. And the level of depth of cooperative interest between Israel and the Emirates. Our president has visited there, the prime minister has visited there, really open relations, much warmer than Jordan, much warmer than the Emirates, than Egypt over all these years. But we've got the success of, think of this, the Abraham Accords. We've got the success of the moving of the embassy. I'm thinking from Prime Minister Netanyahu's point of view. And we've got, you'll see in a minute, the first country in the world to have massive corona, vaccination, very low numbers in corona. But yet the Prime Minister is being investigated in 4 cases, 3 of which end up going to trial. And there are weekly protests in Balfour Street. There it is. That's his house is just back over there in front of the residence of the Prime Minister. So lots of protests are continuing to happen in spite of the fact that stimulus and foreign policy, things are going quite well for Israel. Now, you remember last week I talked about the social protest in 2011 in Israel over cottage cheese and rent and everything else, and the growing gap between the rich and the poor in Israeli society. And just this week, I got an email from the Israel Democracy Institute that's talking about 10 years later, looking at the success, the perceived success of protests. So you look at the protests a decade ago and these in front of the Prime Minister's residence in the past 2 years. The left thinks they're effective, the right less effective, of course, but look at the Balfour protests, that very, very significant left of center, and even right, suggesting that, or putting faith in the ability to have social protests that actually can affect change. Fascinating, by the way. And 70% altogether of Israelis think that protests can influence the government policies. Phenomenal. Because, we're in a country where people have lots of different opinions, and there have been lots and lots of protests. We've seen them in the 6 weeks that you've been with me, from the Sephardic immigrants, the Mizrahi immigrants from Morocco and Wadi Salib in the 50s, the Black Panthers in the 70s. We've seen lots and lots of protests, and it's amazing that people feel, and maybe it's the size of Israel, I don't know, or the passion or whatever it is, but that's phenomenal. If you were to take a poll, and I'm guessing, I don't think I'm off, but if you were to take a poll in America, do protests, social protests have, it depends who you ask. If you ask the most impassioned Black Lives Matter supporters, I'm sure they would say yes, but with limited success, right? But very interesting, in a very small country, the perception amongst people, and this Israel Democracy Institute is a think tank. It's not connected to any political party, funded largely by American philanthropic dollars, but very important site for me, at least, in insights in Israeli society. Our story continues. My boy chick is still there. This is in March in April, I should say, of last year. He asked me to take his team out and guide them around Mount Herzl, which was obviously, I wasn't doing a lot those days, but I was happy to guide. Challenging for me to guide a bunch of officers and standing and career soldiers in the Air Force for a day around Mount Herzl. This was his last picture as he was on his base just before he got released a few months ago. And December 19th, Israel is not the first. I think England started before us, but all of a sudden, this big one day, Saturday night, Prime Minister Netanyahu, the health minister, the president, the commander in chief of the army, December 19th, the first vaccination. Now, Israel vaccinated very quickly. We have 4 HMOs. Everybody's a member of HMO. Every community in the country has HMOs. And the country was closed. Tourists couldn't come in. They can only now start to come in. And Israelis were very few people going out. And stores were closed because we had, I think, 3 or 4 lockdowns. And a cartoonist, of course, sarcastically looks at the prime minister in his throne of all these vaccinations. The only airplanes coming and going are Pfizer planes. All the businesses are closed. Economy's going out of business. So a perception of it looks really good that we're vaccinating on the one hand, but we're still not adequately dealing with issues in Israeli society, and we're in the middle of an election campaign. We go to the ballot in March of 2021. It's our 4th election in 2 years. The only people who are like this, I think, were the people who printed all of these pieces of paper. This time I took a picture inside the ballot box of all the political parties. It doesn't even say the name of the party. For example, this Emet is Labor over here. Where is Likud? This is Machal. It's an acronym or one letter. And you have to know which one it is. And it says in a very small print in Hebrew, and outside the voting booth it says it in English, what the party is. Pick that one piece of paper up. If you have 2, it's void. If you have more than that, and then put it in the envelope, and then they count them. Now, this is March of 2021. We'll come up back to the inconclusive results. But in the midst of trying to cobble together a governing coalition, we're in our 4th round of violence from Gaza. Again, another operation happens. There's tension. It escalates. Almost 2 weeks of sirens. And I'm watching the news one night, and I took a screenshot from my phone. It's crazy, by the way. I have to admit. I mean, I've now a 4-year-old iPhone, and I just freeze my TV on the frame, and I take a picture of it, and I put it on my iPad. It's crazy what we can actually do out of the comfort of our homes with the little technology that we have in our hands. So that's a good thing. Anyway, I'm watching the news, and in the middle of the campaign, every time there's an alert. So there's a siren wherever you are. But if you're watching the TV, let's say you're deaf, you might not hear the siren, of course. But you have this notice that goes up from the home command, and it says sirens have been in these 2 kibbutzim, Kfar Aza and Nachal Oz. And as this young woman, who is a journalist, who lives on one of these 2 kibbutzim, the siren goes off, and the interviewer to the left says to her, says, just a minute, those of you who live in these 2 kibbutzim, please go into your self space. And then she says, and for my friends on whatever kibbutz she lives on, once the all clear, once it's over, go to my apartment and check on my dogs because they really get terrified by these sirens. And it really struck home to me that this is not, war on the other. It's not Afghanistan or Iraq. And this is like real time to real people. This 20-something-year-old journalist living on this kibbutz being interviewed about life there, and the shit, pardon me, hits the fan literally while she's being interviewed. This picture, I'm sure many of you saw on the internet, to me, I think is highlights the bizarre nature of this, quote, asymmetric warfare. Dozens of rockets simultaneously from Gaza, all with a very simple trajectory. And then at the same time, Iron Dome from 1, 2, 3, 4 batteries, you can see it over here, shoots out dozens of interceptor rockets. Each one is targeting one of these rockets coming in, and it moves around to try to position itself to get as close as it can to blow the rocket up, you'll see in the next slide, before it hits it. So this is the asymmetry, right? Billions of dollars invested in rockets that save these people's lives, and these people's lives, by the way, as well. About a third of the rockets land in Gaza, but the 2/3 that get over to Israel, if one were to land in a very densely populated area and have dozens of casualties and fatalities, you can be sure that the Israeli retaliation to Gaza will definitely be a lot harsher than the attacks that had been up until that point. And here's what happens. Here you've got the trajectory coming from Gaza, a straight line, right, or parabola, whatever. It's predictable by the radar and the algorithms. And here you've got the Iron Dome rocket that does basically a 45-degree turn very, very quickly to turn back toward the rocket that it's intercepting. It doesn't hit it directly. It blows itself up nearby. And of course, the shrapnel from the rocket, as I said last week, and the shrapnel from the Iron Dome fall all over the place. During this period, I had to go to, I don't know, the doctor for something. And I'm waiting at the elevator, and I see this sign of the elevator. It's crazy. And here's a sign. There's my HMO, Mukheret. And on it, it says, these are the areas in terms, this is the time you have wherever you live to go for shelter if you hear a siren. So if you live here in the red zone, 5 miles from Gaza, you immediately duck and cover, basically. And if you live over here in the little darker area, you've got 15 seconds. Where I live, so there's Tel Aviv over there, and there's Jerusalem, and there's my little town of Modi'in, literally right over there. We've got between a minute and a minute and a half. Now, it happened twice or three times in the middle of the night where we stop with our windows open, where all of a sudden, 2 a.m, you hear this crazy siren. I mean, it shakes your skin. And you jump out of bed and you try to pick up the 2 cats. The second time I didn't anymore because I got too many scratches. And you go to the bedroom across the hall that is our protected safe space in our room. Every house built after 1990 has one. You close the door, you close the window, and then you wait. How long are you going to wait? You got to put water in there the night before. And then you hear, not too far from you maybe, because about half a mile from where I'm sitting was an Iron Dome battery. The entire town shakes as the outgoing rocket goes out. It intercepts it. You wait 5 minutes. Do you bother going back to bed in the bedroom? Or do you stay in the protected room, which is one kid who's not living at home anymore, their bedroom? Now, this happened to us. We had a minute to a minute and a half, 2, 3, maybe 4 times in this entire operation. People who live here in the yellow, in the orange, in the red, happen daily, dozens and dozens of times. I do not understand how people were able to continue to stay living in those areas. Of course, there were civilian casualties, not many, thankfully, and largely because of your tax dollars, Israeli brainpower that created this amazing thing called the Iron Dome. And here's a group I had, a solidarity group from the New York Federation, and we're standing in front of this Iron Dome battery. Here are the kids. I mean, these are kids. Most of these kids, by the way, their job is to secure and protect this area and to reload the rockets. So you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3. There are 20, I guess, rockets in this position. They don't shoot them from there. It's shot from a radar from a command station not too far away. So we've got this event happening in May, right? We've also got internal violence. I'm not even talking about that between Arabs and Jews in places like Akko, Lod, and Ramla. 10-minute drive from where I'm sitting to you right now by the airport, mixed Jewish Arab city. And just after that, miraculously enough, a government is formed. And the key to this government, formed between Yair Lapid, who won 16 seats in the Knesset, less than Netanyahu's party, but nobody wanted to sit with Netanyahu except those ultra-Orthodox parties, basically. Naftali Bennett, who has now actually 5 seats in the Knesset, who was the prime minister. And this man, Mansour Abbas, his Arab party, for the first time ever, an active part of a governing coalition. They managed to eke enough votes out there, the signatures of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 parties altogether that got, I want to say, 62, 64 seats in the Knesset and are barely able to govern in Israel. The Abbas, very critical, Islamic, and it's an Islamist party, just to put it in context. There are very few, I can't think of any actually, democratic countries, maybe Lebanon, where there is a Islamist ideological party that sits in government, and here we have one in government. It gives you an understanding, though, with everything I've talked about in the past few months, the immense challenges that Israel has to try to keep this government together with such diverse opinions from far right, literally, Bennett, and the finance minister Lieberman, who's not in this picture, and center left Lapid, and far left on the Arab spectrum. So here you've got Lieberman, far right, Lapid, center left, Bennett, right, Gideon Sa'ar to the right, Mansour Abbas as far left as you can go on the political spectrum in Israel, in parliament, Merav Michaeli, Labour Party, Benny Gantz, his own kind of center left party, Nitzan Horowitz, a party left of Labour. All of these people, I say guys, but one of the 8 is a woman, Merav Michaeli, sitting around a table agreeing to govern post Netanyahu. Now, in my last 2 or 3 slides before Q&A, I want to kind of sum up our 6 sessions together. You might not remember, but way back when I introduced this idea of the new Jew, late 19th, really early 20th century, with the second wave of immigration to the land of Israel, I talked about a new Jew, a revolution, creating a new persona that was built on three components: our ability to defend ourselves, ability to work the land as an act of redemption in and of itself, right? Not just redeem the land, but redeem ourselves from what the world had forced us to do for thousands of years. And of course, Hebrew as a language and as a culture. And this idea of the new Jew was this holy trinity, as one of our great poets, Chaim Guri, said, of new Jew. And this iconic image you might not remember from about a month and a half ago that I showed you by the famous Israeli caricaturist Dosh. The name was Shmulek, right? Typical laid-back Israeli. That was then, 100 years ago. Everybody who came pre-48 and then post-48, they thought should be socialized in that image. But Israel has come a long way. And one of the best books, I think, about contemporary Israeli society came out, I want to say 19 or 2020, by two guys, Shmuel Rosenthal and Camille Fuchs. And they talk about, with Dosh, the same image, right, the same caricaturist, Shmulek on the cover, portrait of an Israeli cultural revolution. And they kind of look at four types of Israeli Jews, very different than what the founding fathers and mothers wanted to do 120 years ago. And they essentially say, listen, Israel today, if we look at 55% of the Jews in Israel, about 79, 80% of the population, are somewhere on this axis of increasingly following Jewish tradition, not necessarily religious, but Jewish tradition, and have a combination of Jewish nationality. I put myself there. I remember the reason I moved from Canada to Israel was because for me, being Jewish was both being part of a people and being part of Jewish tradition, right? It's easy to be part of Jewish tradition. You're all members of a synagogue. You wouldn't be here if you weren't. Being part of a Jewish people as a minority, it's a lot more challenging in America, right? Who is this ultra-Orthodox, right, over here? Who is this very, very secular Israelis who really don't even think there should be a state necessarily, Jewish state necessarily, it shouldn't be Jewish, and definitely engage nothing in tradition. But it's amazing that more than half Israelis put themselves here, very different, by the way, from American, and very different from, to review, I guess, I don't know, I can't go back, but very different from the new Jew that I just showed you and we talked about a few weeks ago. One of the main characteristics terms we used to describe Israel in the past generation, the startup nation, which for you sport fans out there is not just about technology, but we actually have this wealthy Canadian Israeli who's very involved in bike riding, and he's the sponsor of Israel's Startup Nation. It's a professional biking team, competes in Tour de France, the Giro d'Italia, and all the major bike races. And last year, for the first time, Dan Martin, an Irish professional rider, won, and one of the treks in Tour de France, I think, or Giro d'Italia, one of the two major ones. And it was amazing to see this guy coming across the finish line with his Israel Startup Nation on his shirt. Order your shirts online, but this is not a promo for that. And on the team in the Tour de France, for the first time ever, were young Israelis, all Israelis, who train in Israel for this biking company, the Israel Biking Academy, and they participate and compete internationally with this Israel Startup Nation. So it's not just something that we Jews are proud of, but there's really an attempt to try to spread the word across the world. The answer is in the numbers of this rich human capital, that huge numbers of 6,400 startup companies as we speak, almost 400 multinational companies have research and development centers in Israel. The numbers in terms of, these are all slides I just added actually in the past few days for you guys, $26 billion of funding for Israeli companies in 2021. We're talking Corona, massive, massive. And look at the increase, right? 26 billion, forget 2020, Corona, but look at that. In 3 years' time, it's gone from about 6 billion, it's gone up 400% in terms of money raised by Israeli companies. Phenomenal. For, again, an economy about $350 million. It all ends well with the Hollander family children. There's my youngest, Boychik, December 30th, cutting his ID card for the Army after 4 years and 1 month in the military, in the Air Force, with the other guys who were released. And I end with two pictures. This is me, and that is Michelle and I picking cherries last summer in the Golan Heights. And God willing, we'll be able to ask many more questions and go a lot deeper when I meet you guys, not just behind a screen, but somewhere in the not too distant future, physically in Israel.
Yes, let's do that. Let's go now.
I don't think United flies on Wednesday nights, if I'm not mistaken, from Chicago.
Maybe we'll give it a little bit of time. But yes, God willing, that will absolutely happen. Mike, on behalf of everybody here, I want to thank you for your incredible ability to teach us literally on the ground in multimodal ways that really connect all of us to Israel, to you, across the world, but still part of the same family. So we are grateful. Can I give them like the little bit of the heads up
Sure.
about
Promo. I like promos.
Perfect. We're gonna give the promo. Just before this class started, Mike and I were firming up the next time he'll be able to teach with us. So look forward to 4 more sessions starting the end of April. Those will vary in topics. The first 2 will likely key into Yom HaShoah v'Hagvura, Holocaust Memorial Day, Yom HaZikaron, and Yom HaAtzmaut, which fall those 2 weeks. And then there'll be 2 additional weeks after that of varying topics. And hopefully, God willing, we'll be able to continue this relationship this way because technology is amazing.
Hold it, Rabbi. I see. Where's Scott? There's Scott. Hi, Scott. You want to say what you just said? Because I actually have a great story about that. So tell the story. Do we have 30 seconds, Rabbi?
Sure.
Go for it, Scott. Unmute yourself.
You're muted, Scott.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I just shared with Mike a company I worked with, a company called Zkit that did virtual try-on, was recently acquired by Walmart, an Israeli-based startup.
And the last time, thank you for sharing that, Scott, because the last time I heard about Zkit was I visited with a group of, it was a women's group. I don't know what I was doing with them. I was guiding them, clearly. But we went to Tel Aviv. There's this place in the basement of the stock exchange, actually, which is all obviously online these days. There's no trading floor like in Chicago. And we met like 2 people for these startups. And one was, oh, that's what it was. It was a group of women from Connecticut, a church group, actually, the pastor who I knew, a man, and like 26 women. And they're like, what Israeli startup are we going to tell these women about? And one of them was Zkit, and we all downloaded the app. And I was like, me and Jim were the 2 men, and there are all these women looking. Oh, you do this, you look good in this. And I think I actually still have the app on the phone, so I didn't even know that they were bought out in May 2021. So that's good news. But literally, if you Google or you follow this stuff, there's not a week that goes by without, a couple $100 million of this company here that you've never heard of, and this company there. So many of my kids, none of mine, unfortunately, are involved in technology, but so many of their friends are in high tech. And that is, to put it in context, one last thing, that less than 10% of Israelis work in high tech, but it really is the fuel that keeps this country going in spite of all the huge challenges that we continue to have.
Amazing. Well, Mike, toda rabah. Lehitraot. We'll look forward to seeing you soon. Thanks, everybody, wherever you are. Stay well, stay safe, and we'll see each other soon.
All right. Thanks. Looking forward. Bye, guys. Stay safe.